The life of Senator Don Oliver is defined by his service to others. Born in Wolfville, his family was the only black family in the town. The racial injustice experienced in his youth would set Senator Oliver on a path of advocacy as he worked to change the systems that perpetuate injustice. An alumnus of Acadia University and Dalhousie University Law School, Senator Oliver maintained distinguished tenures as both a civil litigator and as an educator throughout a legal career that spanned more than 3 decades. Senator Oliver taught law at the Technical University of Nova Scotia, St. Mary's University, and Dalhousie University. He also served as an executive with several private companies and lectured on human rights, the Canadian Constitution, and election law. Senator Oliver is a global spokesperson for diversity, pluralism, fairness, and equality, for which he was awarded 5 honorary doctorate degrees from Canadian universities. His community involvement led to a career in politics, and in 1990, Senator Oliver became the first black man appointed to the Senate. Highly regarded by his Senate colleagues for his hard work and dedication, he would later become the first African Canadian to hold the post of Deputy Speaker of the Senate. One of the crowning achievements of his career as an outspoken social activist for the 4 employment equity target groups in Canada, women, the disabled, Indigenous and visible minorities, was his seminal work in 2004 on the systemic barriers to advancement faced by minorities in both the public and private sectors in Canada. In 2008, Senator Oliver's motion to officially recognize Black History Month across Canada was passed, and is one he describes as a great joy. And it's what brings us together today. In 2013, Senator Oliver retired from the Senate after reaching the mandatory retirement age of 75. Senator Oliver's lifetime of extraordinary contributions to Canada are well recognized. He is the recipient of the Order of Canada, the Order of Nova Scotia, and King's Council honors. His investiture to the Order of Canada in 2020 noted him as a trailblazer who broke down the barriers of systemic racism. As Senator Oliver slowed down, he found time to publish his memoirs. A Matter of Equality, the life's work of Senator Don Oliver, chronicles his childhood growing up in the only black family in Wolfville, his time as a lawyer, businessman, and advocate for the black community in Nova Scotia, and the achievement of becoming the first black man appointed to the Senate. Today, Senator Oliver enjoys country living on his farm, where he's surrounded by vegetable, herb, and flower gardens and open fields, where you can listen to the sounds of nature and see deer grazing and playing almost any time of the day. He calls it his country hideaway that brings him great peace.
Welcome to the Department of Justice launch event for African Heritage Month. The theme for African Heritage Month this year is the Seas of Struggle, African peoples from shore to shore, recognizing the resiliency, strength, and determination of people of African descent, from the shores of Africa to the shores of Nova Scotia. My name is Candace Thomas. I am the Deputy Minister of Justice and Deputy Attorney General. It is my honor to serve as your deputy. Before I introduce our celebrated guest and our talented host, please pause with me wherever you are watching from to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We also acknowledge that Nova Scotia is the birthplace of African people in Canada, and that people of African descent have been in Nova Scotia for over 400 years. We are joining you from the Legislative Library in Province House. This beautiful historic room was once the original home of the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia. We are fortunate to share this space today with our distinguished guest. He has been described as a statesman of integrity, an ethical, just, authentic leader, and someone who has contributed to Canada's evolving democracy. He is a true Canadian treasure, the Honourable Dr. Senator Donald H. Oliver. With Senator Oliver today, off camera, is his wife and life partner of more than 40 years, Linda Oliver. We are thankful to both of them for making the time and the trip from Queens County to be here. Senator Oliver's biography was circulated with the meeting invite and can be found on the SharePoint site. I won't read it, but offer two salient points of reference to set the stage. Dr. Oliver is the first Black man appointed to the Senate of Canada. In 2008, Senator Oliver's motion to officially recognize Black History Month across Canada was passed. Nova Scotia adopted the name African Heritage Month some years later. In 2021, his autobiography was published, entitled A Matter of Equality, The Life's Work of Senator Don Oliver. His words will be drawn upon during today's discussion. Hosting today's fireside conversation with Senator Oliver is our own Ryan Brothers, who started with the department as a summer law student in 2008 and joined the Legal Services Division as a civil litigation lawyer after his call to the Nova Scotia Bar in 2010. Ryan is currently the Director of Legislation, Policy, and Federal, Provincial, Territorial Relations with the Policy and Information Management Division. It is my distinct pleasure to hand things over to Ryan and our esteemed guest, Senator Dr. Donald H. Oliver.
Thank you very much, Deputy Thomas. It's a pleasure for me to be here today, and I'm thrilled to be sitting down here in this historical place with Senator Oliver. So I've been thinking about this all week, and I'm really excited to be here today. So, Senator Oliver, I thought a good place for us to start. I'm a Valley boy. I grew up in the Annapolis Valley, and I know that that you have roots there as well. In your book, you discuss life in Wolfville in the 1940s and 50s, and how the advocacy efforts of family members laid the foundation of what would become your life's work. Please share with us a little what it was like growing up in a Black family in rural Nova Scotia during that time and looking back on it now.
Well, when I look back on it now, I think that I was very, very blessed, and I came from a blessed family, because there, on both sides of my family, my mother's side and my father's side, there was a tradition of hard work, excellence, and being forerunners, breaking down barriers. And just to mention a couple on my mother's side, my mother's father was a preacher who came from the United States into Canada at the turn of the 1900s and went to Acadia and took his divinity degree. And before he came, he asked a missionary who said, "You should come to Acadia and study." He said, "Would they take Black people there?" And she said, "I don't know, but I'm going to check." And so she checked to see if there were any bylaws or regulations saying Black people could not go to Acadia, and there had been an earlier Black graduate. So Reverend Dr. White became famous, and once a month, his sermons would be preached all across Canada. And the service was all across Canada, and he had a young girl, one of his daughters, singing, and her name was Portia White. And the person who accompanied her on the piano was my mother, a very accomplished pianist. And so that's how Portia was known. And Portia, as you know, broke down many barriers. Can you imagine in 1954 being in New York, doing your debut at the town hall? All of the racism and prejudice and barriers and name-calling and innuendo that she would have met, she still did it and persevered. So on my mother's side, there's Dr. White, her father, and her sister Portia, and she had many other brothers and sisters who also did great things. So that was part of my legacy. On my father's side, there were 3 generations. My father didn't have a chance to get an education, and nor did his father and his grandfather. But they all had in them the innate sense of work, hard work. Keep your integrity, keep your nose clean, and do your job, and you will progress and get ahead. So that drive, that integrity comes from my father's side. So that's the background I got from Wolfville.
Mm-hmm. So growing up in that family with that ingrained work ethic, what put you on the path to going to Acadia and later Dalhousie?
Well, Acadia seemed natural. We lived in Wolfville, mm-hmm. just up on the hill from the college. Mm-hmm. And as a student in high school, I used to do maintenance work at Acadia to make money, mowing lawns and that kind of thing. So, and it was just down the hill. And so my sisters, two sisters before me, went to Acadia. So I said, look, I guess what you do is go to Acadia when you graduate from high school. And Wolfville High School was just a couple of blocks down the road. So we just tip-topped down the road, went to Acadia and went through. And then after Acadia, I graduated with honors in 1960. I didn't know what to do. My father wanted me to study theology because he had a son in a first marriage, Reverend Dr. William Oliver, also a great mentor of mine. He broke down all kinds of barriers and was a social reformer here in Nova Scotia, very well known. And so my father wanted me to study theology because theology was on both sides, the Oliver side and the white side. And I wasn't certain, although when I was looking over some papers, I saw an application form to Union Theological Seminary in New York. So I had actually got an application and was going to apply, but I didn't. Mm-hmm. And then I said, well, what else do I want to do? So I applied for a Rhodes Scholarship to see if I could go to Oxford, mm-hmm. and then come back and teach. And then I said, I saw an ad that there was a scholarship for people to go to Dalhousie Law School. It was a big one. And so I applied, and a Sir James Dunn Scholar, and I won it. And there were 5 of us from across Canada who got them. They were really coveted scholarships. So with that, I went to law school.
That's really neat. Just reflecting on that. I followed my sister to St. Mary's University because I thought that's where you go when you go to. And then for me, the gateway to Dalhousie was the Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq Initiative.
Ah, yeah, that's been a great initiative at the law school.
Yeah. So you find yourself at Dalhousie Law School, and I believe you were one of only 2 black students in your graduating class in 1964.
That's correct.
In your book, you recount numerous instances of blatant racism, but the incident at the Q and Cushion Pool Hall as a law student stands out for me. Mm-hmm. As a lawyer, I know that this story will resonate with my colleagues in legal services and throughout justice, who are dedicated to the important role justice plays in eradicating racism in society. Can you recount this experience for us at the Q and Cushion and what it led to?
Sure. I'd like to read a brief excerpt from the book, if I could. Mm. And the book is called A Matter of Equality. And quoting, "There were more than a couple of times in my life when I forgot that my skin colors signaled an immediate physical and emotional problem for many white people in society. One day, while I was at Dalhousie Law School, I was out walking with Darrell T. Warren, a fellow Sir James Dunn Scholar, a tall 6'4" white man from Saskatchewan. Darrell, or Dell as we called him, was passionate and very intense in everything he did. He and his wife had entertained me in their apartment for dinner a couple of times. She was very nice, a short woman with a winning smile. She made me feel comfortable and welcome in her home. I think they both wanted to learn more about Eastern Canada and more about black people. I sensed they had very little direct experience with blacks coming from Saskatchewan. Dell and I skipped an afternoon of studying one day in first year to go play pool. The pool game would be another way of feeling each other out, just to see what type of game each of us had, and to learn more about the person himself. He was eager and ready for the challenge, and so was I. I didn't tell him that when I was in my mid-teens, onlookers would pay me 25 cents if I could break the balls and shoot all 15 without missing. I collected a lot of quarters that way. We checked the yellow pages and found a pool hall near campus called the Q and Cushion. We walked into the small hall in downtown Halifax and looked over its few tables. The room was dark and smelled of cigarette smoke. No music played. Hardly anyone was there. We walked to an open table, took down our cue sticks, racked the balls, and began to play. I got off to a great start and was on a nice one when Darrell vanished for a few moments. He returned limping. I looked at him with concern and surprise. What had happened to him? He was agitated and anxious and said to me in a stern voice, "Leave your cue stick on the table and come with me outdoors immediately." I did what he said and followed him as he limped out the front door. We ran into a tall, skinny man with a big frown on his face, so deep I could almost hear it. He had a cigarette draping from his lips. I sensed that he was the manager or the owner. He stared at me, dark and foreboding, and said, "Don't you realize you're black? You can't come in here." He pointed his finger at Dell. "You can stay." Then he pointed back at me. "You have to go." His racism was right in my face. How could I ever forget something so blatant and fundamental, that I was black in a world where that meant that I would be treated worse than white people, no matter what. This pool hall manager had the white power and privilege to remind me that he thought that I was not equal to white people, that he could say, "Stay, but I must go," merely because of the color of my skin. There was no sign in the door saying I could not go in the hall to play. I had not lived long away from the safety of my family home in Wolfville, and this was a sharp reminder that I would always have to be ready to defend my human rights at all times. This billiard hall experience instilled in me that I will be living virtually all of my life with the constant reminder that I am different from most other Canadians, and that somehow I must prove I am worthy to enjoy the same benefits as the white majority. Dell and I walked back to the campus, thoughtful under the afternoon light. I asked him why he was limping. He stopped, turned, looked at me. "I just made it up," he said. "I did not want to tell you the things the man said about you when he pulled me aside and told me that you had to go. I felt that if I was limping that you would not question it, but would just follow me out as you did." Dell did not want a scene inside the pool hall. I really think that Dell was more shaken by the incident than I was. He had never been party to anything like this sort of blatant racism in his life. We 5 Oliver kids from Wolfville had been called pickaninnies in school, and we had seen a lot more than that. Back on campus, we started to talk about what had happened. Like good lawyers, we researched the issue. I called the Department of Justice and in the provincial government and explained what had happened. My human rights had been violated on racial grounds. I said that such discrimination had to end. The person who took my call said legislation was being drafted that might help. They sent me a copy of the draft and requested my input. I made several notes for changes under the draft legislation. The bill, the Fair Accommodation Practices Act, would make it to law in the province that no one could be kept out of a place to which the public was customarily admitted on the basis of skin color. The bill became law and later became part of the broader Human Rights Act. Places like the Q and Cushion would no longer be legally allowed to bar the public based on race. In the meantime, the Q and Cushion would still have nothing to do with black people in its establishment, so the owners had their lawyers incorporate them as a private society under the Societies Act. You had to become a member of the society to enter the pool hall, and they could refuse membership to anybody. I never did apply to become a member.
Thank you for that. Reading your book, that story stands out. It's a very powerful, and hearing it from you here personally has tremendous impact. So this occurred. You reflected on it, and then you picked up the phone and called the Department of Justice. What was going through your head before and during that telephone conversation?
Well, I felt that legislation was required, and nothing short of that would help to make the kinds of changes that were required. And the Department of Justice, I had known of them before, and I'd known some of the lawyers there and knew of some of the work they did, and I felt this was just the ideal place and the ideal time. And we also had a premier in the 1950s, after 56, Bob Stanfield, who was very interested in human rights and worked with my half-brother, Reverend Dr. Oliver, in formulating some of the provisions of a Human Rights Act for Nova Scotia. So with that in the back of my mind, I said, look, justice plays such an important role in fighting racism and creating the architecture for protecting the rights of all Nova Scotians, that this is the place to start.
So you developed these skills, and you have that ingrained hard work ethic that's instilled in your family, and you sharpen those skills, and then you find yourself practicing here in Halifax.
Yeah, I must say I didn't want to practice at first. I graduated from law school and said, look, I don't want an article, I don't want to go to a law firm. And some of my friends said, look, at least article, and I was lucky enough to be invited to article at the largest law firm in Atlantic Canada. So I went and did my articles, and then they said, you should do 9 more months and get admitted to the bar. Well, in that period, I was offered a job as becoming assistant dean of a new law school in Tanganyika, as it was, in Dar es Salaam, and next year I would have become the dean. That was very appealing. I looked at some other diplomatic jobs that were appealing, and I said, you know, no, I don't want to do those things. So I got admitted to the bar, and then I said, I'm not going to stay here because I don't want to practice. Then when I was doing my articles, I was in court a lot, making pleas for things, and I was learning a little bit about the criminal law. And the next thing I knew, I began to like it, and I began to like trial work. And so my introduction into law was through trials, and I became a trial lawyer. And I just, to this day, I love trials, and I love the drama of trials. And I could have written a whole chapter just on some of the things that happen, and some of the things that juries do, and some of the things you have to say and do to a jury in the presence of a jury to try to make them want to acquit your client. Oh, it was so much fun. But I didn't do much criminal law. I did a lot of civil litigation.
So we're all grateful for your impact on the legal system, and we're very fortunate that you did choose the path of law. While preparing for this conversation, my team and I encountered an article referencing your defense of a Black Panther who had been racially profiled in Halifax in 1969. This was among the many examples when you used your position as a lawyer and lawmaker to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion for Black people and other equity-seeking groups in this province. As you know, in 2019, the Wortley report found that Black Nova Scotians were 5 to 6 more times likely to be street-checked based on their representation in the population. Implementing these remaining recommendations of the Wortley report is a priority for the Department of Justice and our Minister Johns and our deputy. We know this issue goes far beyond criminal justice. what advice would you offer us in the justice system and my colleagues throughout government to move towards eradicating racism and, in particular, anti-Black racism?
Well, I think that first of all, I'm glad this is a priority of the government. I'm really happy to hear that. But first of all, you have to look at a legislative solution, because anything short of that's not going to have the teeth that you need, because with legislation you can impose penalties where required, and many other things. So legislation, which is the voice of the people speaking in law, that's really what's required. So that's the first part of the route. Secondly, the Department of Justice has to maintain the lead in all of these things. Other departments are going to say, oh, this is more my area, this is more my area, but the Justice Department is the key department to ensure that it's done properly and that the legislation is right and it's all-encompassing. And the third thing is that you have to continue to hire good people. I met some of your staff today, and you have to continue to hire people who have the right educational qualifications and who have the right mindset for doing what is right with people. And with that background, that's also going to help materially in making the kinds of changes we need to fulfill all of the recommendations of the report.
When you say that, some themes jump out to me, and the two that jump out the most are having that communication and having the right people in the room. You went from a successful legal practice and you were appointed to the Senate. Can you give us some experiences of your involvement during that time doing exactly that? Is that communicating the important issues and getting the right people in the room?
Oh, that's very, very important. When I went to the Senate in 1990, I did some checking, and there had not been, they called them visible minorities, people of color, you know, Indian, Black, African, West Indian, we were called visible minorities. And when I went to the Senate, there hadn't been a visible minority hired, even in the administrative staff, for 5 years. And so I said, why? And so I went to the Library of Parliament and got in touch with the head there, the clerk of the House of Commons, and the clerk of the Senate had called a meeting. And I said, there's tremendous racism in this institution, and we've got to do something to stop it. And I said, I'd like to see your statistics for your hires for the last 5 years. They had none. They didn't have the data, and that kind of data was required. And so I had more meetings with them, and we did some other things. And finally, that's one of the areas where I was able to make a small change, but by making them keep the records and start hiring more visible minorities in the intermediate and senior ranks of the public service. Now, I must say, when they first started hiring, they were hiring people as guards in the building. And well, that was good because there was some color around the East Block, the West Block, and the Central Block for the first time, Center Block for the first time. But there's one of the things that it was in common with the Senate and the province of Nova Scotia in the work that I did was in the Senate, I found that the senior bureaucrats did not communicate with a major branch of government, and that is the Senate. And so I tried to find a way of getting to break those silos and getting them to work together. And I did it by way of private dinners. I would invite 6 deputies and 6 senators. I would choose a topic, do a 1 or 2 sentence, or 1 or 2 paragraph background on why we were going to discuss this topic. And we'd break bread together, have a glass of wine, and then just open it up to discussion. And the discussions were incredibly exciting because everyone, the Chatham House rules applied, everyone took off their hat, and just spoke very frankly and freely, and both sides learned from each other. And that's something that I think the Department of Justice could be doing here as well. Don't be afraid to talk to people. Like when I was in law school, I was able to have a piece of draft legislation and make some changes. And I don't know if it helped the province or not, but I think it did make a difference. And so if those kinds of exchanges could be continued, it's another great way of making sure that the Department of Justice is not just in tune to where the government wants to go, but where the people want to go. The people as represented by their lawyers and counsel who hear their intimate concerns.
So the themes there that jump out to me is your impact there on looking at the data and understanding that and getting more representation. And then having that representation be at all levels of government. And then that's not enough. It's that once that representation is there, is that ensuring that there's proper communication and the right people are at the table to share views and being able to have those frank conversations to advance justice and priorities throughout government. So moving to kind of a health focus, it's been more than 7 years since your amyloidosis diagnosis, and reading your book, my father had amyloidosis and passed away in 2016, and I remember my family going through that. It wasn't known, and you're very brave to write about it in your book, and I can say that even before this conversation, you've had an indirect impact on me just because of that, those words in the book. What have you learned during this time, and how has health equity factored into your experiences with going through this journey?
Well, first of all, I've met and been helped by a number of doctors, nurses, and aides over this period, and I've had nothing but wonderful support and advice and health work from them. And I was fortunate to be able to make it down to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester in Minnesota, and it's probably the finest hospital in the world, where they have the best doctors in the world. And I got with a cardiologist who, Dr. Grogan, who was a specialist in amyloidosis, cardiac amyloidosis. And if I live long enough, I will probably see her again in Chicago in October. And where I'm going to ask that she examine me again, listen to my heart. But I was going back and forth from Nova Scotia to Minnesota every month for 2 years, getting treatments. And she found an experimental drug that she put me on, and I was on it for a year. And it actually, in my view and in my wife's view, actually stopped the fibrils from my liver going into my heart. And so with that stopped, that gave me some breathing room. So instead of dying in 6 months, I'm still here, that period later. And so, but after a year on that drug, I was in one of those big machines, an MRI, and the technician said, "Do you know a Dr. Grogan? She's outside waiting for you and wants to see you immediately." And where I was, you know, the Mayo Clinic's a big place through several buildings. You have to walk and take buses to get from one place to another. And she was way out of where she normally works. And she said, "Look, I had to see you because the drug company found that people taking the drug that you've been taking have been dying. And so they've stopped the drug as of today. You can no longer have any more drug. And I don't know what I'm going to do." And I said, "Look, I felt the drug was helping me, so I'm going to phone the drug company and tell them, you know, that they shouldn't give it up." So I did phone the drug company, and they were working on another drug, a second one, on Onpattro, And she recommended I take that drug, and I'm on it now. Every 21 days I have a 3.5-hour infusion of Onpattro, and that saved me. But enough about the medical. What has that done? Well, I've become very disabled. There are a lot of things I couldn't do before. When I retired from the Senate, I had a bucket list of things that I wanted to do, places I wanted to travel to, things I wanted to do at the farm, and so on. And writing a book was not one of them, by the way. But I said, look, I have to adjust my life to what I can do. My heart was so weak, only pumping at about 30% of what it should be able to. So I get tired quite easily, and I have to take medication to slow down my heart. So my blood pressure's not too high. My pressure's not going like that because the heart wouldn't stand it. And so I couldn't get the fast cars that I wanted when I retired. And in fact, I can't drive now at all because my feet and my hands can't be coordinated. I can't work in the gardens. I can't have horses around or cows or chickens or anything. I can't hunt. I can't hardly fish because I can't hold things in my hands. I can't get a fly on my fly rod. So I can't do any of those things I used to do before. So what can I do? Well, I have a den with books like this, and that's my life, and I'm there every day, and looking, reading, and I can look out the window and see the deer and the birds and the other animals, and the flower gardens, all different colors. I have a whole row of lilies, and that come up, and they're beautiful, day lilies. And so I said, I take advantage of what I can. So I do some writing. I spend a lot of time on my iPad doing emails, and I do speeches, an awful lot of Zooms and Microsoft. And in last February, I did something like 22 speeches on Zoom, and for all variety of causes. In addition to that, I give the occasional speech. The last ones were at St. FX for Brian Mulrooney at his Institute of Governance. And I did a major speech for the annual meeting of municipalities for Nova Scotia, talking about the importance of equity in municipalities, because it has to start there. You can't start with the federal government. It's got to start with the grassroots. What can you do there? Are you bringing in diverse people to work in your municipality? And that's the challenge. You know, they can't all be lily white. So, and I'm also working on ways that I can mentor more black students personally by meeting and talking with them, which I certainly did at St. FX and other places, and setting up prizes for black writers, and setting up provisions for black artists of all kinds to go to a retreat for weeks or for months, whatever they want, just to get their heads together, to rethink what they're doing, to have another look at their poetry or their piece of art or their book or their whatever it is. And so I want to make sure that blacks have the same access to that, so we're funding that as well. So it's things like that I've now been working on.
So you haven't slowed down.
You'd have to ask my wife about that. What jumps out to me, so when you saw an injustice in the justice system, you picked up the telephone and you sought to correct it, and you had an impact correcting it. When you saw some issue in your own life with your health, you pick up the telephone and use those advocacy skills to advocate for yourself. Now, in your downtime, you've written a book, and you're impacting Canadians from across the country and beyond, and you're impacting youth and uplifting youth. So that's absolutely tremendous. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and appreciated how frank you've been and sharing us
going beyond what you've put in your book. Before I pass things over to the deputy to give some closing remarks, is there anything else that that you like to say or to tell the Department of Justice and our colleagues?
Well, I'm delighted with the work that I see the Department of Justice doing in relation to many of the intrinsic problems that blacks have. And it's not just being picked up and checked on the streets, but it's in school, and it's in sports, and it's in many other things. So the Department of Justice has got the ability now to have its eyes and ears in all those places, and when necessary, make the necessary legislative changes. So I just say, keep up, keep on going the way that that the department is, and Nova Scotia will soon be a star in Canada for what it's doing in eradicating these systemic problems. So that would be one piece of advice. I guess the other thing I'd like to say in closing is not directly related to the Department of Justice, but in the book I tell about being married at the farm where I live, and my half-brother, Reverend Dr. Oliver, did the ceremony. And before we had the ceremony, we had a complete rehearsal. And we went over everything, and the vows, and how you do that, and who does this, and where the rings go, and all that. So we went through all of those things. And then we came to the day of the service. I had my sister and friends there from Bermuda and elsewhere, and Texas. And it was this very, very small wedding, 25 people. And so he said, and now I'm going to do the vows. So we did the vows. And then he turned to me and he said, "Salute the bride." And I said, "That wasn't in our rehearsal notes. What does that mean?" And I remember I was a cadet, very young in high school, and when the senior people came in the room, I'd start bringing up my hand like that. So there I was in the middle of the ceremony, bringing up my hand like this, and Linda grabbed the hand and put it down and started to kiss me, and everyone clapped. So you know, there are times my legal training might have been a little too rigid, you know, and not knowing what the salute meant. So I just wanted to leave that with you.
That's funny. Well, thank you truly, Senator Oliver. This has been a lot of fun.
Well, thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
What an amazing conversation. I hope that you have enjoyed hearing directly from Senator Oliver and Ryan as much as I have. While I was listening, I just jotted down a few notes inside the cover of my copy of Senator Oliver's book, which is fairly worn and flagged. But I just wanted to touch on a couple of things that we heard during that very engaging conversation, and of course, the personal level at which the Senator shared his story with us, as Ryan mentioned, beyond what is between the covers of his book, and also how nicely Ryan also wove in his personal connections with respect to Senator Oliver's life. And a glimpse of such a rich, full life that we all just received. Not just a life of service, as we can all relate to, but one of industry and scholar and business, from activism to rural Nova Scotia to our nation's capital. I believe there's something that Senator Oliver has said that will resonate with each one of you. I think the importance of family values speaks a lot as well, we heard, to the man that he became and all that he has achieved. When you think about the roots and the family determination of activism, working hard and doing all that you can to remove those barriers, to achieve all that one can be. I think that one of the other things that you may have as a takeaway is that driving connection to what we do every day here at Justice. And to be left with words of Senator Oliver letting us know that it's about the legislation to make sure that we can impact in a very permanent way and in a very positive way the lives of Nova Scotians and people, the people that work within our government to make sure that there is diversity there, but also that part about people caring. For him, in the 90s, when he started with his impact, it was simply about caring about people and what we do. And the fact that there should be no silos, and we have all learned that lesson well, and the critical importance of data. I'm going to stop there and share some of the thank yous that we have to give for pulling together this very special, it was a unique experience for those of us in the room today, sharing this message with Senator Oliver. So the challenge for Nova Scotia to be a star in Canada to eradicate racism was the message that I had at the end that he left us with. So now to say thank you. As a small expression of our gratitude to Senator and Mrs. Oliver, the Department of Justice will be donating to the Young Black Voices Book Prize that Senator Oliver established last year, that will be awarded annually to encourage young Black writers to publish both fiction and nonfiction. I have to thank everyone who contributed to this event. From the Policy and Information Management Division, our host and co-lead organizer, Ryan Brothers, David Atchinson, and Margaret Ann Brewer, the Accessibility Directorate team, our communications team, Internal Communications Coordinator and co-lead organizer Nadia Gardin, Director Peter McLaughlin, and Media Relations Advisor Amanda Pelham. Co-lead organizer, Senior Advisor of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, Emmanuel Itive, and the other members of the department's Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessible Committee, and the entire media crew here from Communications Nova Scotia. And last but not least, the staff here at Province House for accommodating us. I also want to thank every one of you at DOJ for consistently delivering for the people of Nova Scotia. On behalf of Minister Brad Johns, our newly appointed Associate Deputy Ministers, Michelle Higgins and Chris Collett, and the entire executive team, including myself, thank you. The calendar of African Heritage Month events is saved on SharePoint. Enjoy the month, be well, and stay safe.